Elena Marsh had spent 11 years teaching high school biology in a mountain town that most maps forgot, and she had built her whole quiet life around the idea that she would never again let a living thing depend on her the way the dying do. Then on the coldest night of a February that had already buried the county under 30 inches of snow, something scratched at her door. When she opened it, she found a starving military working dog collapsed on the boards, ribs like a fence under a coat matted with blood, and on the metal tag hanging from his throat was a name she had buried 4 years before. What she chose to do in the next 90 seconds would drag a respectable man's secret out of the frozen ground, and it would, though she could not yet know it, teach her that the rescue running both directions is the only kind that ever heals anyone. The wind that night came down off the ridge the way grief comes, without knocking, filling every seam of the old farmhouse, until the windows breathed and the panes shivered in their frames like something living. Elena sat in the single lamplit corner of the front room with a mug of tea gone cold in her hands, and she listened to the storm test the roof, going over the shakes the way a thief tries doors, and she thought, as she often did on nights like this, that solitude was simply the intelligent arrangement of a person who had already lost what could be lost. She was 41 years old. She had a good stove that threw honest heat, a full woodpile stacked to the eaves under a tarp she had lashed down against exactly this kind of weather, a dog-eared field guide to the local flora that she read the way other people read scripture, and a strict private rule that she did not answer questions about the framed photograph she kept face down in the drawer of her bedside table. Mercy, she had decided long ago, was a debt that only ever came due, and she had paid enough of it to know the interest was cruel. The tea was cold. The wind had teeth. And then, under the wind, so small, she thought, at first it was only a branch dragging against the siding, came a sound that did not belong to weather at all. A scratching, deliberate and even. 3 strokes, a pause, 3 strokes again, as though something out in the killing cold had been trained to be patient even at the very edge of dying, and was spending the last of its patience on her door. She set the mug down on the sill and did not move for a long moment. Her first instinct, honed by years of choosing safety over almost everything, was to leave it. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down an unplowed road that no plow would touch before Monday. The sheriff's substation had closed at 5 on Friday and would not open again until it did. And whatever was out there in the dark had already demonstrated that it understood doors, that it had learned somewhere that scratching produced results, and a thing that understands doors is a thing that has lived among people, and things that have lived among people and end up out in a blizzard alone have usually been driven there. But the sound came again, weaker this time, the 3rd stroke of the 2nd set, trailing off into nothing, and something in the rhythm of it, that trained patience, that flat refusal to simply lie down in the drift and let the cold have its way, reached past every fence she had built in 4 years and touched the part of her that had once believed she had been put on this earth for the single purpose of keeping small things breathing. She crossed the room. Her socks were silent on the plank floor. She turned the deadbolt, and the sound of it was very loud. She opened the door into a solid wall of cold, and the storm shoved a fan of snow across the threshold and over her feet, and there on the porch, boards folded down against the wind, as though it had spent the last of itself simply to arrive at this one address, lay a dog. He was enormous, and he was almost gone. A shepherd of some heavy working line, the kind bred for weight and endurance across bad ground. But the endurance had all been spent long ago, and what remained was a great frame draped in a coat that hunger had turned to sackcloth stretched over sticks. His ribs rose and fell too fast and far too shallow, a bellows with a hole in it. One hind leg was crusted, dark and stiff with blood that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. His muzzle was seamed with old scars, the neat straight kind that wire leaves, and his eyes, when they found her face through the driving snow, held not the panic of a wild thing cornered, but something far worse, the terrible, level, patient attention of an animal that had been taught from puppyhood to trust human hands. and that had learned somewhere along the road exactly what human hands were capable of doing, and had come to her anyway. He did not growl, he did not so much as flinch when she moved. He lifted his great head perhaps an inch off the boards, looked at her as though confirming the number on a house he had been sent to find, and let it drop. Elena was on her knees before she had decided to move at all. Her hands, which had spent 4 patient years learning to stay folded, and still remembered work, she had believed she had scrubbed out of them for good. She got one arm under his chest, and one under his hindquarters, and he was so light, so much lighter than a dog of that build had any right to be, that she nearly overbalanced backward into her own front hall. She dragged him across the threshold, his nails skittering weakly on the wood, and she kicked the door shut behind him against the shriek of the storm, and she laid him down on the braided rag rug in front of the stove where the heat was strongest. And only then, with the firelight full on him, did she see the tag. It hung from a heavy leather Andilon collar, half buried in the matted fur of his throat, a flat rectangle of metal, dulled to pewter by years of wear, and she turned it toward the light with 2 fingers, because some part of her already knew, the way you know, the weight of a footstep coming up a familiar stair in the dark, that the name stamped into it was going to take her whole life and turn it over. The engraving was worn but legible. A service designation she did not recognize. A working dog's registered name, in a language that snagged in her chest. And beneath it, in the small block where a handler's name is stamped, 4 letters, then 5, that she had not spoken aloud in 4 years. Daniel Marsh. Her brother. For a long moment the room simply did not contain her. She was not in the farmhouse with the fire ticking. She was in a chapel with cold light and folded hands, and a folded flag passed into her arms, and a man in dress uniform explaining, in the flattened, careful voice they train into people who must say these things over and over, that her brother, a Navy SEAL who had spent his final deployment training in handling multi-purpose canines at a forward facility, had died in a training accident overseas, that there were no remains beyond what the fire had left, that his effects would follow in due course. She had never gotten the dog. She had asked, once, weakly, in the fog of that first month when her sentences did not finish themselves, and she had been told, gently and firmly, that the animal had been killed alongside her brother. She had accepted it, because accepting it was easier than the alternative, which was to keep pulling on a single loose thread, until the whole garment of the official story came apart in her hands and left her holding rags in the wind. She had put the photograph face down in the drawer. She had left the ranch country of her childhood and moved up into these mountains where nobody knew her losses. She had built her fences, board by board, and she had told herself the fences were wisdom. And now, here was the dog. 4 years later, half starved down to the architecture of himself, wire-scarred, bleeding from a leg someone had ruined, and then patched, just enough to keep. And he had scratched. 3 strokes and a pause, and 3 strokes at the door of the one person on the entire earth whose blood carried the same name that was stamped into the metal at his throat. Dogs do not read maps. They do not track a stranger across county lines and a state border, through 30 inches of new snow, to a house they have never in their lives seen. Somebody had brought him near here. Somebody had had him all this time, alive and breathing and suffering. In the 4 years she had spent believing he was ash on a foreign hillside. She knelt on the rug with the tag pinched between 2 fingers, and she did the one thing she had promised herself over and over she would never do again, which was to let a living creature matter to her. And she said his registered name out loud, the name Daniel had chosen for him in their grandmother's tongue, and the dog's ears moved just barely, a fraction toward her voice. And his tail lifted and thumped the floor one single time. And Elena Marsh, who had arranged her entire existence around the discipline of not weeping, put her face down against the filthy, freezing fur of his neck and wept as though the storm outside had finally found a seam and gotten all the way into the house. Then she made herself stop, because he was dying and grief was a luxury for the living. and she had learned the order of those two things the hard way. She counted his breaths against her palm. 42 in a minute, far too fast, the count of a body burning fuel it did not have. She pressed her fingers to the inside of his thigh above the ruined leg and found a pulse that fluttered under them like a moth against a lamp. She lifted his lip, and his gums were pale as candle wax, nearly white, and when she pressed one with her thumbnail, the color took long seconds to crawl back. He was in shock, hypothermic, and profoundly dehydrated. And the leg wound, ugly as it was the least of what was trying to kill him. She had no veterinary training beyond the biology she taught to bored teenagers, and the hard practical knowledge of a woman who had grown up on a ranch pulling cabs and doctoring stock in the dark. But she knew the order of operations for a body shutting down, the way you know a prayer you learned before you understood it. Warm first, then fluids, slow, then the wound last. She built the fire up until it roared in the box, and the stovepipe pinged with the heat. She stripped the blankets off her own bed and wrapped him in them, then filled 2 plastic jugs with water hot from the tap, and packed them against his belly and his chest, against the deep places where the great vessels ran close to the surface. She dripped warm sugar water onto the flat of his tongue with a turkey baster, a few drops at a time, waiting each time to see the muscles of his throat work before she gave more, because pouring liquid into an animal too weak to swallow does not save it. It drowns it. He swallowed. It took him a long time, a labor visible in the whole length of his neck, but he swallowed. And every single time he managed it, she said his name. And every single time she said his name, his tail found the strength for that one exhausted thump against the floor, as though the name and the swallowing were the same act. As though he had been waiting 4 years to hear it spoken by the right voice. She worked over him for 2 hours, while the storm hammered the ridge, and the house groaned around them both. She did not let herself think about the sheer impossibility of him. She did not think about the man in the dress uniform, or the flag she had signed for, or the 4 years she had spent living inside a lie she had swallowed whole. Because the truth was too heavy for a single grieving woman to lift alone. She thought about breaths per minute, and the color creeping back into gums, and the slow, grudging return of warmth to the pads of his paws, which she checked with the back of her fingers every few minutes the way you check bread. Somewhere in the 3rd hour his breathing dropped from 42 down to 30, and then to 28, and when his eyes opened they held less of that terrible patience and more of something she recognized from years of watching dying things either give up or refuse to, the small, hard beginning of a decision to live. Around 3 in the morning he lifted his head unbidden and drank from the bowl she held to him. Real drinking, greedy and clumsy and sloppy, water going everywhere, and when he was done he laid his head across her knee and slept. She sat on the cold floor, with her back against the warm iron of the stove, and her hand flat on his ribs, feeling them rise and fall, and she did not sleep at all, because a woman who has just learned that the ground she has stood on for 4 years was painted over a hole does not sleep. She watched him breathe until the pewter light came, and somewhere in that long vigil she made a promise she did not yet fully understand, the kind of promise that quietly reorders an entire life around itself before the person making it has read the fine print. She was going to find out who had had him. She was going to find out what had truly happened to her brother. And this time, she was not going to let go of the thread until the whole thing lay in pieces in her hands. Morning came, the color of pewter, the storm blown south, down the range, the world outside so bright and blank and merciless that it hurt to look at it. The dog was still alive. This alone felt to her like a violation of some fundamental law she had been living under for 4 years. He slept most of that first day, surfacing only to drink and once, with her arm under him for balance, to stand on legs that shook like a newborn's and totter to the door and relieve himself in the snow, an act of such stubborn animal dignity, such refusal to foul the place that had taken him in, that she had to turn her face away from it. She fed him tiny meals of boiled chicken and plain rice every 2 hours through the day, no more than she could hold in a cupped hand, because a starved body given too much too fast will kill itself trying to digest the gift, and between the feedings she worked at the leg. She clipped away the matted fur with a pair of blunt-nosed scissors and cleaned the wound with saline. She mixed herself, and when she had it clean, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had uncovered, and the cold, clear anger that had been waiting under her ribs for 4 years finally stood up. Because the wound was not an accident. The tissue had been torn open, and then, weeks ago, by the pink and gray look of the halted healing, deliberately closed again with the wrong kind of suture, the coarse, ugly kind you would use on canvas, and then left to fester. Somebody with rough field knowledge had hurt this dog on purpose, and then patched him just barely enough to keep him alive and useful. She sat there, with the scissors loose in her hand, and felt the anger move through her, the clean, cold kind, which she understood now was only love that has been ordered to sit down and has refused to obey. She needed help. She could not provide. The mountain had exactly one veterinarian, a woman named Ruth Okafor, who ran a large animal practice out of a converted dairy barn 12 miles down the valley, and who was known in the way that everyone in a small county is known, whether they consent to it or not, for 2 things. The first was that she was the finest diagnostician within 100 hard miles in any direction. The second was that she had lost her husband, a wildlife biologist named Thomas, in a fall from a ridge trail 3 years back. A fall that half the county whispered over back fences had not been the accident the ruling had called it. Elena had met Ruth exactly twice, once at the feed store arguing amiably over the price of a mineral block, and once at a stranger's funeral, and she had liked the woman immediately, the way one fenced-off person recognizes the particular set of another's shoulders across a room. She bundled the dog into the bed of her truck on a deep nest of blankets, chained up all 4 tires in the frozen yard with her breath smoking, and drove the treacherous switchbacks down into the valley with her heart lodged high in her throat, and the tag which she had unclipped from the collar and could not stop touching, riding in the breast pocket of her coat like a live coal that would not cool. Ruth Okafor took one look at the dog in the barn's examination bay, and stopped being polite, which Elena would later understand was the highest respect the woman could pay a patient. Her hands went over him with the swift, certain, unsentimental economy of someone who had spent 30 years reading the bodies of animals that could not tell her where it hurt, and her broad face settled into a professional stillness that told Elena more than any string of words could have. She read the refeeding schedule Elena had scribbled on the back of a receipt and grunted, a short sound low in her chest, which Elena would learn was the highest form of praise Ruth Okafor issued to another human being. She examined the ruined leg and said, without lifting her eyes from it, that whoever had done this had done it before, more than once on more than one animal, and that the specific pattern of it, the tearing and the closing and the tearing again in the same place, was consistent with an animal being used to bait or to condition other animals to aggression, or being punished on a schedule that had nothing to do with anything the dog had done. Then she parted the fur inside his right ear and found the registration number tattooed there, faded blue and cracked but readable under her loupe, and she carried it to the battered computer in her office and ran it against the working dog databases she could reach as a licensed practitioner. And Elena, watching from the doorway, saw the color go out of the woman's face. The dog, Ruth said quietly, was listed as deceased. Killed in action alongside his handler 4 years ago this coming spring. There was a death certificate on file. There was a line drawn in a ledger somewhere. And yet here he was on her steel table, breathing, 28 breaths to the minute now, with the wrong sutures rotting in his leg, and another human being's deliberate cruelty written across every inch of him. Elena took the tag out of her breast pocket and set it down on the cold steel table between them, and she told Ruth the handler's name, and she told her that the handler had been her brother, and she watched the veterinarian go very still, the stillness of a woman hearing a sound she has heard once before in the dark. Ruth Okafor sat down slowly on the rolling stool beside the table as though her knees had abruptly withdrawn their cooperation, and she said, in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, that she knew that name. Not the man. The name. It was in her husband's notes. Thomas, in the last handful of months before he went off that ridge, had been quietly investigating something out at the Halverson Ranch, a sprawling operation on the far dry side of the county owned by August Halverson, a man whose framed photograph hung on the wall of the community center for his generosity to the volunteer fire department and the elementary school and 3 of the county's churches. A man who had crossed the grass at Thomas's funeral and clasped Ruth's hand in both of his. Thomas, she said, had come to believe that Halverson was running something out of the back 40 of that ranch, something that involved animals arriving and never leaving. And he had found himself a source inside it, and the source had a name, and the name was Daniel Marsh. And then Thomas had walked up a familiar trail he had climbed 100 times in every season, on a clear bright morning with good footing, and he had come back down it wrapped in a bag, and the county had shaken its head and called it a tragedy, and Ruth had believed them because believing them was so much easier than the alternative, which was to understand that she was living 12 miles from the man who had killed her husband and eating at church suppers he had paid for. The 2 women looked at each other across the steel table and across the dog, who breathed steadily and evenly on it, now warm and hydrated and pulled back a long way from the edge, and something passed between them that was older and heavier than friendship. It was the recognition of 2 people who had each swallowed a comfortable lie in order to avoid choking on a terrible truth, and who had now both of them been handed that same truth by a starving dog scratching at a door in the middle of a blizzard. Ruth said the sentence out loud that neither of them had wanted to be the one to say. She said it was not 2 accidents. She said it was a pattern, and patterns do not fall out of the sky. Patterns have authors, and Elena Marsh, standing in a converted dairy barn 12 miles from home, with her dead brother's living dog under her flat hand and her dead brother's name in a dead man's notebook, felt the whole fence she had built around herself over 4 careful years come down, not with a crash. The way snow slides off a steep roof in the first warm sun of spring, all at once and without any sound at all, and utterly beyond calling back, revealing the raw shape of everything that had been hidden under it. They agreed, that very first day, on rules, because both of them had already learned in the hardest possible school that grief and anger together make people stupid. And that stupid people in this county got thrown off ridges. Ruth would treat the dog and document every single thing, every wound and every measurement and every x-ray plate, with the meticulous chain of custody discipline of a woman building a legal case rather than nursing a private grudge. Elena would say nothing to anyone, to no one at all, about the tag, or the name, or the impossible fact of the animal's survival. And neither of them, under any provocation, would go anywhere near the Halvorsen Ranch. Not yet. Not until they understood the size and shape of what they were walking toward. The dog, whom Elena had begun without ever quite deciding to think of by the name Daniel, had given him, grew stronger by the day and then by the hour. Within a week, he could walk the full length of the barn and back, without resting. Within 2, he had appointed himself Elena's shadow, pressing the point of his shoulder against her leg wherever in the world she happened to be standing, and she discovered that his weight against her, the plain undeniable animal fact of him, did more to hold her together than 4 years of careful engineered solitude ever had. He had opinions, she learned, and he did not keep them to himself. He disapproved of the truck's heater on some deep principle she never fully worked out. He believed, with the whole force of his considerable conviction, that any food prepared for a human being was by ancient natural right, at least, partly his. He watched Ruth make her morning coffee with the grave, narrow attention of a health inspector on a mission, and found the entire process wanting. He was, in short, alive. Thoroughly and stubbornly and comically alive, and his aliveness was a daily standing argument against every single thing Elena had told herself about the wisdom of not caring. But he was also afraid, and Elena came to understand that his fears were a map that if she read them carefully enough, they would show her where he had been. He could not bear the sound of a particular kind of diesel engine, the deep, uneven idle of a big flatbed truck, and the one time such a truck passed slow on the valley road while they stood together in the barn's yard. He had thrown himself flat to the frozen ground and shaken every muscle until the sound was long gone. He flinched from raised hands, from any arm lifted quickly above shoulder height. He flinched worst of all from one specific sound, the dry metallic rattle of a heavy chain being gathered and coiled. And the first time Ruth coiled a stall chain within his hearing, he had bitten through his own lip. And he had. Ruth discovered on a second and more thorough examination, once he was strong enough to endure it, something lodged under the skin over his left shoulder that did not belong there, a small, hard, foreign object about the size of a grain of rice. She numbed the spot with a bleb of lidocaine and worked it out with a pair of fine forceps and dropped it into a stainless steel dish where it landed with a small clean chime, and the two women bent their heads together over it. One of the objects she drew out was a microchip, which was entirely ordinary, the kind any responsible owner has implanted. But beside it, in the dish, lay a second object, and that one was not ordinary at all, not in any world. It was a tiny sealed capsule of stainless steel, machined and threaded, the kind made to protect a rolled slip of paper or a small memory card against water and time, and it had been sutured deliberately and carefully beneath the skin by someone who wanted it hidden and wanted it to survive. Someone who had used the one creature that everyone in the world had agreed was dead, a dog who officially no longer existed anywhere but in a death certificate as a courier for a message they did not dare to send by any other means. Ruth opened the capsule under the barn's brightest examination lamp, unthreading it with a delicacy she would have given a bleeding artery, and inside, packed tight, was a slip of waxed paper folded down to the size of a fingernail. But she unfolded it with two probes, breathing shallowly, and on it, in a tiny, cramped, urgent hand that Elena recognized across the table, with a physical lurch that folded her forward at the waist, was a list. Coordinates, latitude and longitude, 4 sets of them. Dates going back nearly 5 years. A column of dollar amounts, some of them staggering. And beneath all of it a single sentence, written last and smallest, the letters crowded together and running downhill as though both space and time had been sprinting out from under the pen. It is not training. They are killing them for the buyers and burning the records. If you found him, they know I sent him. Trust the vet, trust no one else, and get him to my sister. Elena read it standing up, and then she read it sitting down on the cold barn floor with her back against the base of a cabinet, and the dog's heavy head laid deliberately in her lap, and slowly, completely, the whole shape of it came clear to her. Her brother had not died in a training accident. He had discovered something at that ranch, something to do with the trafficking and the slaughter of working animals and the laundering of the dirty money through a respectable man's generous charity, and he had understood that he was in mortal danger, and he had done the only thing a handler in that trap could think to do. He had loaded his evidence onto the one creature on this earth. He trusted without any reservation whatsoever, and he had pointed the dog at his sister. And then he had been killed before he could get the animal clear, and the dog had spent 4 years in that man's hands, tortured on a schedule, and starved, and used to make other dogs cruel, waiting with that terrible learned patience for one single chance to finish the last order his handler had ever given him. And when the chance finally came, in a February blizzard, 4 years too late, the dog had crossed unknown miles of frozen country and scratched 3, and a pause, and 3, at exactly the right door. Because a good dog does not forget the last thing the person he loved asked of him. Elena did not sleep that night either. She sat at her own kitchen table, with the wax slip of paper flattened out under the base of an upturned drinking glass, and the dog pressed warm along the length of her feet under the table, and she felt something rise in her that she had not felt since before the folded flag, which was purpose, the clean and terrible clarity of a person who has finally, after years of drifting, learned what she is for. She had spent 4 years believing that caring about anything was a debt that would only ever come due and demand its ruinous interest. She saw now, in the lamplight, that she had had the whole equation exactly backward. The dog stretched out under her table had paid a debt that no one on earth had asked him to pay, had carried a truth across 4 years in a state line and 30 inches of killing snow at the cost of nearly everything a living body has to give. And he had done it not because he owed anyone anything, but because love, the real kind, the kind that outlasts distance and pain and 4 years of silence and abuse, is not a debt at all. It is a direction. It is the way a good creature turns its face, even when every other light has gone out. She reached down under the table and put her hand flat on the top of his broad skull and told him, quietly, in the empty kitchen, that he had done his job, that he had done it perfectly, that he could rest now, and that she would carry the thing the rest of the way herself. And she meant every word of it, and she was entirely wrong about the resting part, because he had no intention at all of ever again letting her carry anything alone. The next morning she and Ruth drove down together to the sheriff's substation. And this is exactly where the story could have ended. Quietly and badly, the way so many stories about powerful men in small counties end, in a drawer, except for the particular man they found behind the desk. Deputy Marcus Bell was 57 years old. 3 years out from a full pension, he had earned the slow way, and possessed of exactly the kind of grinding, unglamorous, bone-deep respect for procedure that makes for a tedious dinner companion and an absolutely unstoppable investigator. He had grown up in the county. He had gone to the same small school as August Halverson. He had also, though he had never once said it aloud to another living person, never quite been able to swallow the Okafor ruling, because he had walked that same ridge trail himself as a boy, chasing grouse, and he knew in his gut that a fit man who had climbed it 100 times did not simply step off the edge of it on a clear windless morning. He listened to the two women all the way through without once interrupting, which Elena would later understand was itself a rare and telling thing in a man of his position. He looked at the tag, turning it in the light. He looked at the photographs of the ear tattoo, and at Ruth's thick folder of meticulous medical documentation, and at the death certificate that said in an official hand that this animal was Ash. And last of all, he looked for a long time at the waxed slip of paper and its plastic evidence bag, and Elena watched a man decide, in real time, right there at his cluttered desk, to spend the last 3 years of his working life on a fight he could not be at all sure he was going to win. He said the thing she needed to hear and did not want to. He said that a slip of paper and a dog, however moving both of them were, was not a case. He said that August Halverson owned a bank and most of the mortgages in a county, and at the very least one sitting judge's lasting gratitude, and that if they moved too soon with too little in their hands, Halverson would bury it, and bury them, and bury the dog, and bury Daniel Marsh's name so deep that nobody would ever dig it out again. He said, leaning forward with his forearms on the desk, that what her brother had died to expose deserved a great deal better than a mistrial and a headline that faded in a week. What they needed, he told them, was the very thing her brother had already told them existed in his own crowded downhill hand: the records, the buyers, the money. Halverson was burning the records Daniel had written, which meant, Bell pointed out, that he had not yet finished burning them, which meant that somewhere out on that ranch there was still a ledger, physical or digital, that tied the dead animals to the living dollars. They would sit on their hands and build slowly and carefully, and let August Halverson go right on believing that his old convenient accidents had stayed comfortably buried under the years. Elena hated every single word of it, and she knew every single word of it was right. Ruth reached across the corner of the desk and gripped Elena's wrist, once hard enough to leave the memory of it, and Elena understood in that grip that the veterinarian had spent 3 long years wanting to do something stupid and honorable and doomed, and had held herself back from it, and was now asking Elena to hold back too. So they held back. They built, and they waited for August Halverson to make the single mistake that men like him always, eventually, make, which is to assume that the small, ordinary people around their lives are exactly as small and as ordinary as they appear to be from the height of a great deal of money. He made it within the week, because their caution had a hole in it that none of them had thought to see. The feed store clerk, a chatty and entirely well-meaning young man named Petey, who wished harm to nobody, mentioned in passing to a Halverson ranch, hand-loading sacks of grain, that Doc Okafor had herself a real interesting stray out in her barn. A big shepherd, somebody dumped poor half-dead thing on death's door when it came in, and now up walking around. The ranch hand said nothing at all. He paid for the grain and he drove the long, dusty road back out to the ranch. And that evening a big flatbed diesel came up Ruth Okafor's lane and idled at the end of it, headlights dark, for exactly 90 seconds by the clock, on Elena's phone, and then it turned around slow in the wide spot and drove back out again. And the dog, who had been dozing by the stove in the practice's back room, came up off the floor all at once, rigid, hackles standing in a ridge, a low sound in his chest, and Elena knew, watching him tremble and stare at the door, that the 90 seconds had been an inventory. They had been told for 4 years that this dog was dead. Now they had reason to suspect that he was not. And a man who has spent 4 careful years being careful becomes, in the exact moment his carefulness fails him, an extremely dangerous animal. The intimidation when it came was courteous, and the courtesy of it was the worst part of all. 2 days after the flatbed, a lawyer's letter arrived at Ruth's practice, printed on paper, so heavy and cream-colored that it felt like a thin slab of stone in the hand, informing her that a valued client of the firm had reason to believe that an animal presently in her possession had been stolen some time ago from his property, that the animal in question was valuable breeding stock of a documented working line, and that any failure to immediately surrender the animal to its rightful owner would result in the pursuit of criminal charges for theft and the harboring of stolen property. It was signed by a firm in the city with 3 grand old names in it, and it was, as legal instruments go, complete and transparent nonsense, because a dog cannot be simultaneously dead on a certificate the owner himself had filed with the state, and also alive and valuable and stolen. But it had not been written to win in a courtroom. It had been written to say, in the smooth, clean, untraceable language that respectable cruelty always chooses for itself, "We know that you have him, and we want him back, and we are able to make your life very expensive and very frightening whenever we choose to." Ruth read it aloud at Elena's kitchen table in a flat and shaking fury, and when she reached the end of it, Deputy Bell, who had driven up to look at the fresh flatbed tire impressions pressed into the mud at the bottom of the lane, wound down his coffee mug very deliberately and said that the letter was the best thing that had happened to them since the dog had crawled up onto that porch, because a man does not send a city law firm to reclaim valuable breeding stock that he himself has certified as dead, unless that man is badly frightened, and a man who keeps his records close makes them very much easier to find, because he keeps them all in one guarded place. They very nearly lost the dog that same night. Elena woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of him barking, not his ordinary alert bark, but a deep sustained alarm from somewhere down at the bottom of his chest that raised every hair on her body and had her out of bed before she was properly awake. And she came down the stairs in the dark to find him planted square, in front of the back door with his hackles up in a full ridge, and his weight dropped low, and his lips off his teeth, facing something out in the black of the yard. And beyond the cold glass of the door, she saw a flashlight beam swinging low and careless, and a shape moving through the snow toward the woodshed where she kept the spare propane tanks. She did not stop to think. She hit the switch for the yard lights, flooding everything white, and she grabbed the shotgun that her brother had given her the last Christmas he was alive, and she stepped out onto the porch in her nightclothes and racked it. That one hard sliding sound that requires no translation into any language spoken by men. And the shape out in the sudden light froze mid-stride, and then it turned and bolted for the tree line, and she heard a truck door and an engine turning over hard and gravel spraying. And then nothing at all but the dog beside her on the porch, still barking, still deliberately between her body and the dark. In the gray morning, Belle found a 5-gallon steel can, an unspent road flare abandoned in the trampled snow at the corner of the woodshed, and he did not say the word arson out loud, but he wrote something in his notebook with his jaw set, and he told Elena gently that she and the dog and Ruth were all going to move together now, into one place they could actually defend. Because August Halverson had gone from vague suspicion to lawyer's letters to a gas can in the space of 9 days, and that acceleration meant only one thing, that he believed himself to be running out of time. And a man who believes he is running out of time is a man about to burn everything he cannot carry, which meant that they were within days of losing the records forever unless they found a way to move first. So they moved, all 3 of them and the dog, up to an old fishing lodge above the frozen reservoir that belonged to the elderly priest of Elena's church, Father Amos Whitfield, who had presided over the burial of her brother's empty coffin 4 years before, and who, when she came to him and told him the whole impossible story in the confessional dimness of his book-lined study, closed his eyes for a long moment behind his glasses, and then said only that a truth which walks 4 years through the snow to find you is not a thing that a person is permitted to bury a second time, and that the lodge was theirs for as long as they needed it, and that he would keep the county's ears occupied in the meantime with the ordinary comfortable noise of an old priest going busily about his week. He gave them the iron key. He gave them his blessing with 2 fingers. And he gave them, without any of them thinking to ask for it, the name of a man at the State Agricultural Office who owed the diocese an old favor and who had been quietly building his own thick file on the Halverson operation for the better part of 2 years, unable to move a single inch on it for the simple lack of any witness willing to attach a living name to a sworn statement. Now Father Amos had a small dry smile moving at the corner of his mouth. They had a witness who could never be silenced, because he had never once been alive to be threatened in the first place. He meant the dog, of course. And it was the first time Elena had laughed in longer than she could reckon, a startled, cracked, broken sound that surprised the 2 of them equally, and the dog, hearing it, thumped his tail hard against the old floorboards, as though he had been waiting the whole of his 4 hard years for exactly that one sound to come out of her. The break came from the inside, the way it almost always does. A young woman named Cassie Renner had worked the last 8 months at the Halvorsen Ranch as a kennel hand, a job she had taken on because it paid steady and because she loved animals and because she had not understood, at first in her first weeks, what the fenced-back 40 of the operation was actually for. She had come to understand it the way a person comes to understand a bad smell in a house. Slowly, and then all at once, and unbearably, on the particular night she was told to load a truck in the dark, and to not ask what was in the crates, and to not count them coming back empty. She had driven home that night and been sick in her own yard and lain awake until dawn, and she had decided she was going to quit quietly and say nothing to anyone, because saying something to anyone in this county was the kind of thing that got a person thrown off a ridge in good weather. But then she had heard, through the very same broken gossip network that had betrayed them all to Halverson, that Doc Okafor had gotten herself tangled up in something to do with a dog that had come back from the dead. And Cassie Renner, who had grown up sitting in a hard church pew every Sunday of her childhood, had decided, lying awake a second night, that a dog coming back from the dead was precisely the kind of sign that a person did not get to look away from. She drove up to the lodge in the full dark, with her headlights switched off for the last mile of washboard road, and she stood shaking in the doorway with the cold pouring in around her, and she said that she wanted to help, and she said that she knew where the records were kept. They were not on a computer. August Halverson did not trust computers, a lifelong paranoia that had kept him safe for a decade and was now about to be the exact instrument of his ruin. He kept a single physical ledger, a green cloth-bound book with a cracked spine, in a floor safe set into the concrete of the office in the main barn, and every buyer and every date and every dollar was entered into it in his own careful hand, because he did not trust any other living person to hold the whole shape of it in their head. Cassie had seen it exactly once, lying open on his desk when she had come in unannounced, with a question before he had swept it closed and away into a drawer and looked at her over the top of his reading glasses in a way that had made her decide to keep her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. For the entire remainder of her employment, Bell listened to every word of this with his notebook open on his knee, and then he did the one thing that separated him decisively from the reckless Honorable Dead, which is that he did not immediately climb into his truck and drive out to the ranch. He went instead to a judge, not the grateful one who owed Halverson. He drove 2 counties over to a semi-retired circuit judge with a wide reputation for a personal and abiding hatred of powerful men who thought the law was a thing that happened to other people, and he laid it all out on the man's kitchen table, in careful order. The tag, the photograph tattoo, the falsified death certificate, the falsified stolen property letter that flatly contradicted the death certificate the same owner had filed. Ruth's meticulous, unassailable documentation of systematic, long-term cruelty, the abandoned gas can, and the tire impressions. And last of all, the sworn signed statement of an eyewitness employee who could describe the ledger, its color, its binding, and the precise location of the floor safe that held it. And he came back 30 hours later, gray with exhaustion, with a warrant. And the warrant was the whole entire game, because a warrant meant that they no longer had to break a single law to reach the truth. The law itself would open the door for them and walk them in. But warrants take a day to be executed, and a day was exactly the amount of time that August Halverson turned out to need, because the same broken gossip network that had delivered Cassie Renner to their door had also, that same evening, delivered word to Halverson that his own kennel hand's little truck had been seen parked up at the old fishing lodge above the reservoir. He did the arithmetic in his head faster than any of them had feared he would. He knew now that the dog was alive. He knew that a stubborn valley vet and a dead man's grieving sister and a deputy 3 years from his pension were all circling closer. And now he knew that his own hired hand had crossed over to them and could stand up and describe his ledger and his safe. So August Halverson made his decision, and his decision was to burn the ranch. Not merely the records. The whole operation, the main barn and the kennels and the ledger, locked in its safe. One clean, bright, uncomplicated insurance fire that would erase every animal living and dead, and every incriminating page in a single night. An accident. And this county was so very, very good at accidents. Cassie, who still had a working phone tied into the ranch's standing supply orders, saw a large delivery of accelerant logged under a false company name for a pre-dawn arrival, and she understood in her bones exactly what it meant. And she woke the entire lodge at midnight with the news that the records they held a lawful warrant for would be nothing but cooling ash by sunrise unless somebody got out there first. This was the moment the whole long story had been driving toward from the porch onward. And it was also the exact moment that Elena Marsh wanted, more than she had wanted anything in 4 hollowed-out years, to become the very thing she had set out to fight. She wanted to take her brother's shotgun down off the pegs and drive out to that ranch alone in the dark, and put her own body between August Halverson and his fire, and make him answer with her own 2 hands for the folded flag and the ridge trail and 4 years of a good dog's methodical suffering. She was halfway across the lodge to the door, with the truck keys already biting into her closed fist, before Ruth caught her hard by the arm, and Bell stepped his bulk in front of the door. And it was neither of them that actually stopped her. It was the dog. He had planted himself against her legs, all of his considerable heeled weight, and he was not looking at the door at all. He was looking straight up at her face. And in his eyes was that same terrible, learned patience she had first met on her frozen porch, the patience of a creature who had already been taught in the hardest school exactly what human hands were capable of doing. And she understood in one cold, plunging instant that he was afraid. Not of the storm, not of the diesel, not of the men out in the dark. Of her, of what she was about to let herself become. Of the raised hand and the hard, clean, simple rage that had carved those wire scars into his own scarred muzzle in the first place. She stood frozen in the doorway with the keys cutting into her palm, and the dog leaned his whole weight into her legs. And Elena named her 3 anchors out loud the way Ruth had patiently taught her to do when the flashback came for her. The plank floor solid beneath her boots, the sound of the dog breathing steady at her knee, and she came back down into her own body, and she set the keys down on the table, and she wept for the second time in 4 years. And this time it was not grief at all. It was the sound a fence makes, coming down. They went together, all of them, because that was the whole lesson. That was the thing 4 years and a dog had come to teach her, that no one goes alone. Bell drove, radioing the warrant details ahead to a state trooper he had known for 20 years and trusted with his life. And Cassie rode up front to point the turnings, and Elena and Ruth and the dog rode together in the back of the truck through the Black Valley toward the orange glow that had already begun to smudge and stain the eastern edge of the sky. They came up the long ranch lane to find the main barn burning fiercely at its far end, flames standing up through the roof line, and August Halverson himself standing calm in the yard in his good gray wool coat, calm as a man watching the successful completion of a long project. A 5-gallon can tipped empty at his feet, and 2 frightened hired men shifting behind him. And behind the barn, the kennels, full of the animals he had planned to let burn along with the evidence, dozens of dogs, ribs, and Terra, throwing themselves again and again against the wire as the smoke rolled low toward them. Paul? Not. Halverson looked at the truck as it stopped, and at the dog standing tall in its bed, and something moved across his respectable face, not fear exactly, but the particular deep affront of a powerful man discovering that a thing he had personally certified as dead had refused, all this time, to extend him the simple courtesy of staying that way. He raised his voice over the roar of the fire and said, in the smooth, clean tone of the lawyer's heavy letter, that this was his private property, that they were all of them trespassing, that whatever they believed they knew, they could prove exactly nothing once the barn was gone, and that the deputy in particular ought to think very carefully indeed about his pension before he took one more step. Bell got down out of the truck with the warrant held up in one hand, and he read it aloud into the noise of the fire, every dry procedural word of it, from the caption to the judge's signature, and it was the single most beautiful thing that Elena had ever heard in her life. Because it meant that the door was legally open, and the truth was on their side of it, and August Halverson's whole decade-long strategy of tidy accidents had just run head-on into the one thing that no accident can survive, which is a living witness and a signed warrant and a paper trail in the man's own hand. But the barn was burning, and the ledger was inside it in its safe, and the animals were inside their kennels, and a warrant does not put out a fire. So they made the choice, all of them at the same instant, the very choice her brother had made on his own porch 4 years before, and the dog had made in the blizzard, which is that the living thing in front of you comes first. Always, before the evidence and before the vengeance and before your own safety. Bell and Cassie ran together for the kennels and through the gate latches and drove the panicking dogs out into the open yard, and the trooper's cruiser came screaming up the lane with its light bar throwing red and blue across the snow. And Ruth ran for the barn office because she was the only one among them who knew on sight what a green cloth-bound ledger looked like, and where in a concrete floor a safe would be set. And Elena ran after her into the heat, and the dog ran with Elena, always with Elena, and August Halverson, watching a decade of careful, patient cruelty come apart around him in 90 seconds, did the one thing that finally, at the last, made him small. He picked up a length of steel pipe from the ground, and he swung it with both hands at Ruth Okafor's back as she ran past him toward the burning door. The dog took it. He came up off the ground the way he must have been trained to years and years before the wire and the starvation and the 4 years in the dark had been laid over the top of him, and he put his own body in the air between the pipe and the woman, and the blow that would have broken Ruth Okafor's spine broke instead, across his left shoulder. The same shoulder that had carried the capsule and her brother's last message all those miles through the snow. The same shoulder that had leaned its whole weight against Elena's legs in the doorway of the lodge an hour before, and he went down hard in the churning smoke and did not immediately get back up. And Elena, watching her brother's dog fall a second time in his life to protect someone that he had decided, all on his own, to love, felt the rage stand up in her again, hot and clean and terribly simple, and she knew that her brother's shotgun was in the bed of the truck not 20 feet away across the trampled snow. And August Halverson was standing over her fallen dog with the pipe already lifted again for a second blow, and no jury drawn from any county on earth would ever have blamed her for what her hands wanted to do. She did not do it. She had learned the lesson the hardest way there is to learn it, and she had learned it for good and all, down in the marrow where the important things live. She did not become him. Instead, she did the harder and the better thing, the thing that cost her more than any trigger ever could, which was to drop to her knees in the smoke beside the dog and get her arms under him exactly as she had on her own porch on the coldest night of February, one under the chest and one under the hindquarters, and drag him back out of the reach of the pipe and put her own unarmed body between the cruelty and the living thing and let the law take the man. And the law took him. The trooper crossed the yard at a run and put August Halverson face down in the dirty snow and cuffed his hands behind his good gray wool coat in the flickering light of his own fire, while Ruth Okafor came out of the burning barn office at a flat dead sprint with a green cloth-bound ledger clutched hard against her chest, singed black along one edge and smoking faintly but whole, every buyer and every date and every dollar recorded inside it in August Halverson's own careful damning hand. The dog lived. That is the part Elena needed the most and feared the most in equal measure, and she got it, though not easily, and not for free, and not without a long night of doubt beside a stove. Ruth worked on him that night back at the lodge by the light of 2 lamps with the same swift, certain, unsentimental economy that Elena had first watched within the dairy barn, and the shoulder was broken, but it was a clean break in a good place, and it would knit and heal, and the smoke had scorched his throat raw but had not reached down into his lungs. And around the coming of dawn he lifted his head off the folded blanket and looked at Elena with clear, steady eyes and thumped his tail once, twice, against the boards, and she put her face down against his neck the exact way she had that first night in the storm, and this time she was laughing and weeping at the same moment. And the difference between the two had finally, mercifully stopped mattering to her at all. 28 dogs came out of those kennels, alive into the yard that night. Ruth counted them herself, twice, moving among them in the gray light with her hands and her voice, and she wrote the number down in her documentation before she did anything else, because numbers are how you tell the truth to people who will not believe your grief, because a number cannot be argued down the way a feeling can. 28 alive. The ledger, when they read it through, recorded 91 that had not been. The reckoning, when it finally came the exact way Deputy Bell had promised her that it would, which is to say, slowly and tediously and utterly, without any of the clean, bright satisfaction that stories like to pretend that justice hands over at the end. It took 19 months from the night of the fire to the last day in the courtroom. There were hearings, and there were postponements, and there was a change of venue granted, and then fought over, and there was a small standing army of expensive city lawyers who tried, exactly as Bell had warned them from behind his cluttered desk, to bury the whole thing under a mountain of paper and motions and delay. But they could not bury the ledger, because it was written in August Halverson's own unmistakable hand, and 3 separate examiners swore to it. And they could not bury Cassie Renner, because she stood up in a courtroom in a borrowed blue blazer with her hand shaking and described the crates and the night deliveries and the safe in a voice that trembled the whole time, and did not once stop or take back a word. And they could not bury Ruth's documentation, because it was meticulous beyond any lawyer's attack. And above and beyond all of it, they could not bury the dog who had been certified dead by the defendant's own filing with the state, and who sat at Elena's feet in the gallery every single day of that long trial, alive, breathing, gray now at the muzzle, a living, breathing contradiction of every lie the defense stood up to tell. August Halverson went to prison, and so did 2 of his buyers, whose names were in the Green Book, and the money that his generous charity had laundered clean was traced back through the accounts and clawed back dollar by dollar. And it was not clean, and it was not complete, and some of the guilty were never named and never touched, but it was real, and it lasted. And lasting is more than Spectacle has ever once managed to do. They cleared her brother's name. That was the part Elena had not dared to let herself hope for. The part she had walled off even from her own private wanting. Deputy Bell, working the coordinates and the dates from the waxed slip of paper against the entries in the ledger and against the service records that the Navy grudgingly and slowly consented to open, was able to reconstruct what had truly happened 4 years before. How a young handler had discovered the operation while his unit trained animals at a forward facility that Halverson quietly supplied. How he had gathered his evidence in secret over weeks and sealed it in a machined steel capsule beneath the skin of the one creature on Earth he trusted without reservation. How he had been killed before he could get the dog free of the place. His death dressed up neatly as a training accident by people whom August Halverson's money and reach could touch even that far from home. The official record was corrected. Daniel Marsh was no longer a young man who had died in an accident overseas. He was a man who had died protecting a truth. And the Navy, in its slow-grinding, bureaucratic way, acknowledged it in writing. And there was a second service held in the small mountain church. A real one this time, with the truth standing behind it. Father Amos spoke, and Ruth spoke, and the dog lay the whole time at the foot of the flag with his healed shoulder and his gray frosted muzzle, and Elena stood up in front of the small gathered congregation and said her brother's name out loud, the same way she had said the dog's name on her porch in a storm, and it did not break her. Vindication does not erase a loss. She understood that. Clearly, now, in her body, it reorders it. It takes a death that seemed to mean nothing, and it gives it back to you, meaning everything. And you carry it differently forever after that. Not lighter, never lighter, but truer. They also cleared Ruth's husband, whose fall from the ridge trail was re-examined in the hard new light of the ledger and the corrected record, and was quietly reclassified from accident to something with a colder name. And Ruth Okafor stood at that same second service and wept openly for the first time in 3 years, her shoulders shaking. And Elena reached over and held her by the wrist, the exact way Ruth had once held her across a deputy's desk, and 2 fenced-off women who had each swallowed a comfortable lie to keep from choking on a terrible truth, discovered together that the fences had come down for good and were not going back up. And that what lay on the far side of them was not the danger they had each spent years fearing, but simply each other, and the work in front of them, and the dog, and a reason to keep a light burning after dark. There came a morning in the spring when the reservoir had thawed to open water, and the snow was gone from everything but the high north slopes, and Elena drove the dog up to the ridge where her brother's evidence said his unit had once trained a high meadow gone thick and green with new grass, and she unclipped the lead from his collar and let him go free. She had thought a great deal through the long winter about whether he would want to go, whether 4 years in the dark had left him aching for the wide world back, whether the truest kindness left to her was to simply open her hands and let him run and to get no vote at all in whatever he chose to do with the running. He ran. He ran the whole length of that green meadow with his healed shoulder working smooth beneath the coat that had come back thick and glossy, his gray muzzle held high into the wind and his ears up, and Elena stood at the near edge of the grass with her heart high in her throat and let him choose. Because she had learned at last that the ones you truly love get to choose, and that love holding on with a closed fist is only possession wearing a kinder name over its face. He ran all the way to the far tree line, and he stopped there, and he stood a long moment with his back to her, looking out at the whole wide green rolling world that he had crossed a state and a blizzard to reach, and then he turned himself around and he ran all the way back across the meadow to her, and sat down hard against her legs, all of his weight, the way he had in the doorway of the lodge. And he looked up at her face with those clear, patient eyes, and she understood that he had chosen, and that what he had chosen was her. and that the rescue had been running in both directions the entire time, from the very first scratch at the very first door. A year after that, the sanctuary opened its gate. They built it on a parcel of land that had once been part of the Halverson Ranch, seized in the judgment, and sold at auction and bought back with the clawed-back money, and Father Amos's diocese standing behind the loan, and a fund named for 2 men who had died protecting the truth. Ruth ran the medical side out of a clean new building, and Cassie ran the kennels and the intake with a gentleness that came out of everything she had seen, and Belle, retired now, and restless and secretly delighted to have somewhere to be, ran the fundraising that he loudly pretended to hate and quietly loved, and Elena ran all of it and none of it. The way you run a thing that has become your life rather than your job. The 28 dogs that had come out of the fire that night lived out their days in that green valley, and the ones that could be safely placed were placed with families vetted as carefully as if they were adopting children. And the ones, too, broken in their spirits to ever leave, stayed, and were loved anyway, every one of them. Because being too broken to leave is not the same thing at all as being too broken to be loved. The old fishing lodge became a house, and the house had a lamp in the window that Elena kept burning. There was no romance in any of it, and no need for one, only a gathered and wildly improbable family of people who had each learned the very same lesson from the very same dog, which is that a home is simply the place that keeps the light on after dark and makes room, always makes room, for the wounded things scratching at the door. The dog grew old the way that the good ones do, gray to white at the muzzle, slow and deliberate on the stairs, dignified about the whole business of it, and he slept every night at the foot of Elena's bed, where the framed photograph now stood upright on the table beside her. Her brother's young face smiling out into the room at last, instead of pressed face down in the dark of a closed drawer. And on the coldest nights of the winters that came after, when the wind came down off the ridge without knocking the way grief does, Elena would lie awake and listen to him breathe 42 shallow desperate breaths a minute, once on the worst night of her life, and now the slow even untroubled breath of a creature who is warm and fed and safe, and finally wholly done with his long hard work, and she would reach her hand down in the dark and lay it flat against his ribs and feel them rise and fall, no longer offensive bone under sackcloth, but a full and solid and living warmth. And she would think about the night that he had scratched at her door and dragged the whole buried truth in out of the storm on his own dying back. And she would understand, all over again, freshly, what it was that he had come all that way to teach her. So here is what a starving dog scratching at a door in a blizzard has to say to you. Wherever you are tonight, whatever it is you have quietly decided to stop caring about in order to feel safe. You have built your fences too, most likely. You have called your isolation a kind of wisdom, and your grief a kind of prudence, and you have arranged the whole architecture of your life around never again letting a living thing depend on you the way the dying do, because you paid that debt once, and it very nearly finished you. And you were wrong, in exactly the way that Elena Marsh was wrong, because love is not a debt that comes due and demands its ruinous interest. It is a direction. It is the way a good creature turns its face when every other light has gone out, and it survives distance, and it survives pain, and it survives 4 years of silence and 30 inches of killing snow, and it will cross any ground on earth that you put in front of it to scratch. 3 strokes and a pause, and 3 strokes again. At the one single door where it knows in its bones it will be answered. The rescue always runs in both directions. The wounded thing lying on your porch has come to save you exactly as much as you have gone out into the cold to save it. Mercy will not erase your grief. Nothing will erase your grief, and you should stop waiting for the thing that will. But mercy will reorder it, and it will give it back into your open hands, meaning everything instead of nothing. And it will arrive when you least expect it and least deserve it, inconvenient and half dead and bleeding on your good clean boards, on the coldest night of the whole year. And all that you have to do, all that you have ever once had to do, is get up out of your cold chair and cross the room in your sock feet and turn the deadbolt and open the door, Answer the scratching. Keep the light burning in the window. Make room, always make room. And when the truth comes walking 4 long years through the snow to find you, do not, whatever it costs you, however heavy it is to lift, bury it a second time.